Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are honored to be sitting down with Colin Cantrell. Colin is a software architect, engineer, musician, and composer. He was raised in the aerospace industry and took up programming at the age of 11. He's helped build rockets, and with his combined interest, he founded Nexus in 2014, which brought together technologies to promote a greater distribution of resources and communication. Colin's ultimate vision is to increase the accessibility of technology in order to help people to build a greater connection to one another. Thank you so much, Colin, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, the Nexus blockchain offers a powerful API based software stack which enables apps to transition into a decentralized future. So, I'm curious, how does Nexus make decentralization more possible than other blockchains?
Through a lot of different aspects, I guess. I mean, one of which is just having on-chain scalability, right? Bitcoin doesn't scale on chain, Ethereum doesn't scale on chain. So they've talked about, having lightning networks, and I think Ethereum they called theirs plasma, stuff like that. So the first step is you really have to be able to scale on chain. If you can't scale on chain, then you're always going to kind of run into these centralized risks. And one of the ways that we do is through an architecture that I call a three-dimensional chain. So if you kind of use reality as an example, in a line, let's say there's only so many points that you can plot on a line, right? But then you have two dimensions, x, y, that you can plot, exponentially more, to the square. And then when you add a third dimension, then you add to the cube capacity, right? Or storage capacity. So we basically, a blockchain, a conventional blockchain is just a single dimensional chain structure. It's kind of like a line, right? So what we're doing is we're making a cube, which is being unfolded through, three updates to Tritium, Omnium, and Obsidian. And this three-dimensional chain, right, is, gonna really, how should I say, is going to solve a lot of the issues with decentralization of the mining, right? Because it's going to be kind of a share-based mining system instead of a winner-take-all. And it's kind of like building the block in real time for many different participants. And so the block itself will kind of have properties like a blockchain where you have a block header and you can do Merkle verification for a transaction to that Merkle root in the block header. It'll be similar with a 3D block, except you'll be able to have a lot more data in it, and it'll be processed in parallel by different individuals. So that's is kind of, I guess you combine together the sharding with multidimensional chaining and things like that, to really kind of help with that. And then other aspects that we do is multiple consensus methods, such as two proof of work channels, a prime one and a hash one, and then a proof of stake and stuff like that. So one way that we found is just checking and balancing through different consensus mechanisms. And then lastly, a decentralized autonomous organization for regulating the funding mechanism. One of Bitcoin's pitfalls is that it did not have any sort of internal funding mechanism. So, it relied on donations through the Bitcoin Foundation for a number of years until for-profit company Blockstream came and kind of, skirted out all the other developers that were against their narrative. So that did leave Bitcoin somewhat vulnerable. The central points of failures are generally, your development and your mining, which, Bitcoin is, 5-6 people, I think, run, the 5 or 6 biggest mining pools in the world. So between that and then 5 or 6 developers, you've got control of the entire protocol, which is 10 to 12 people. So we believe that the blockchain architecture, which is just kind of a play on cipher blockchaining and B money, which is an old architecture from cypherpunks. I mean, we believe that architecture itself is the first successful implementation of it as a distributed system working and functional, but it's not the end all. It's kind of like the vacuum tube, right? Vacuum tubes were used back in the early days for computers when computers took up the size of a room. But the architecture of a vacuum tube just wasn't sufficient to make it small enough to fit in everyone's pocket. So it was ultimately the transistors architecture that was able to take that switch to a level that it was cheap enough for everybody to be able to use. So another aspect of the decentralization is kind of balancing this availability issue with the security issue, right? You got to make it available for people to be able to contribute so that more people are a part of the consensus, but you also don't want to sacrifice security in that same sense.
So, you don't think Bitcoin is as decentralized as others suggest?
Generally not. No, I mean it's more of an oligarchy. You have a for-profit company, Blockstream, that pretty much runs all the development. I mean, Bitcoin's so how should I say? We wouldn't have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 Bitcoins if Bitcoin was sufficiently decentralized, or if it had proper consensus mechanisms built into it. One of the reasons that Bitcoin split in two is because of the block size debate, which is what Blockstream utilized as kind of their narrative to push for Lightning Network and segregated witness. And there was the agreement for segregated 2x, SegWit 2x, I think is what it was called, where, they finally came to an agreement where they said, okay, well, if you give us segregated witness, the Blockstream guys, then we'll give you 2 megabyte blocks. Right. And, when it came down to it, they didn't honor their side of the agreement. So that's why Bitcoin split into Bitcoin Cash, right? And then Bitcoin Cash split even again. And so, development and mining is highly centralized on Bitcoin because of mining pools, right? And the one hash takes all issue too, because all this mining power that's being used on the network, only one small subset of that gets actually utilized in the creation of the block, because only one hash wins, right? Where all these other people could be doing work, but that work's not going anywhere. It just gets reset every time there's a new block, right? So when you have a small collection of people, right, that are maintaining the source code, and a small collection of people that are really maintaining the mining security, you do get centralized tendencies, you get centralized risks. And, it's pretty clear from, there being multiple Bitcoins that there were consensus failures. And, one side, a significant portion of the Bitcoin community decided to break off, because they just felt like, decisions weren't being made in their best interests. So yeah, I definitely don't see it as decentralized as people claim it to be. It is in the sense that, it's difficult to be able to produce blocks. So you have this layer of security. And I think people sometimes maybe mistake the two of, oh yeah, well, Bitcoin's, one of the more secure, right, because of the hashing power, but it definitely doesn't mean that it's decentralized. Especially with the Lightning Network and all of the other proposed scaling solutions. I mean, mathematically, the Lightning Network, just based off of the total number of connections it would require to actually have an open connection between two channels, it's just mathematically, it's just impossible. It's improbable. It's going to require liquidity providers generally, which is, if you think about it too, like I'm depositing my Bitcoin into this Lightning channel, and then I can transact on the Lightning Network as long as that's deposited in this Lightning channel. And then I settle it back on the Bitcoin blockchain as soon as I'm done with all of that. So what does that sound like? Well, I deposit it into an account, and then I can transact on the payment network, and then I withdraw it out of the account. It's a bank account, right? It's the Lightning Network is an aim to make banking relevant on Bitcoin, right? And part of that is because of this centralized takeover, right, of the Bitcoin development, which eventually split it into multiple chains, essentially.
You mentioned that the Bitcoin mining model is more winner takes all. What is a shared mining model?
Well, with our 3-dimensional chain, what we're doing is we're having it kind of a share based. So everybody's working on the same data set, right? They're working on the same root cube, let's call it. But they're mining for a duration rather than mining to win. So they're mining for, a fixed duration of 1 minute, right? And once, that minute is up, then you submit your most, I guess, the highest work hash that you have into it. And then all of the other miners submit those hashes too. So therefore, all of these hashes are, for one, they're going to have to be off of a consistent input, right? Which means they're working off of the same root cube. So you get this secondary consensus on top of it, where miners are agreeing on the same set of transaction history in order to send shares together, right? To agree on these shares together. And then also you're capturing all of this additional mining power, because with Bitcoin, one person, let's say they have 1% of the hash power and they get a block, right? The 99% of the hash power is now gone. Like, is all of that time that they spent the last 10 minutes mining for that block, 99% of the network, that power just doesn't go into the actual consensus. So you're only actually harvesting a small amount of the proof of work in Bitcoin. With Nexus and the 3-dimensional chain, everybody's going to be real time submitting these shares, right? Finding the highest weighted share they possibly can. And then all these shares are then hashed together into a final root hash. And that aggregated weight, right, contains the combined hashing power of everybody for that interval. So, if only there is no, like, quote unquote winner of the round, like there is on Bitcoin mining, it's this consensus mechanism where the miners are relying on the trust and the weight and reputation of the block that they're actually verifying. And so the miners can compete. Let's say if there's like a competitive 2 3D blocks that are trying to compete for one another, but ultimately the miners that are choosing each one of those, right, their mining power is going to go consistently into that block, right? So that when I get that block, I can actually verify and see, all of these other shares that were submitted to it that all contain the same inputs, right, for that root cube, so that they're, for one, agreeing on the same set of transaction history, which Bitcoin doesn't do. It just says, okay, well, the block with the most proof of work is considered the valid transaction history. There's no real consensus on the transactions beforehand. It's just, hey, if it's in the mempool and it's picked up and put on a block, then it becomes valid. This way, you create these checking and balancing where all of these different layers are verifying this data, and then the miners are selecting the one with the highest amount of weight and trust, because then they're going to add that weight and trust through their mining process, and then they're not wasting power. Like, they're actually earning money every single one of these intervals if they're hashing towards it, right? So you're able to capture more of that actual proof of work into the security model, which gives you an increased availability for people, right? Where somebody with a single GPU can, try their best to get a hash. They may not get very much for that round, but they can still get a little bit in, right? So that increases the availability, but it also increases the security, because it's not just as one hash rules all, and that determines the transaction history. It's actually based off of thousands of miners agreeing on the same set of transactions before they start mining, not just, hey, I'm just going to randomly, stochastically select these from my mempool and then mine them and then submit them. So it creates multiple layers of consensus, that increases the security, and it more effectively captures the full hashing power.
I'm curious, what have been the biggest challenges for you in realizing your vision of building a different type of blockchain?
That's a good question. I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges is just we didn't have any industry to bootstrap from, right? So like Bitcoin, right, when it first came out, there was no exchanges, there was no block explorers, and as the Bitcoin industry evolved, then people start developing block explorers, and then people start cloning Bitcoin, right? And then so naturally all of these cloned coins like Litecoin or anything else worked, right, for with the Bitcoin type block explorer. But for us, we upgraded the cryptography, we upgraded the private keys. I mean, we made so many massive changes to it that nothing was backwards compatible, right? So we've had to build all of that infrastructure ourselves from the ground up, right? Including like the miners. Like, I mean, we have our own unique, hashing algorithm. We have our own unique prime algorithm. It's just everything about it is unique. So it created an infrastructural problem where we just can't piggyback off of the infrastructure in ways that other projects can. And then, the other aspect too is just kind of fixing this cultural issue that we notice. I mean, the blockchain industry has a lot of merit, okay, but it hasn't realized that merit. And a lot of the mindset of people in crypto is that, oh, it's already achieved it. It's the Ethereum's the world's supercomputer, and Bitcoin is decentralized, and it's going to be peer-to-peer cash. And but the folly in that is that they're neglecting the technology. And what I mean by that is a lot of people believe that technology doesn't matter because something like Tron is a top 10 coin, let's say. But that is only true when it's still an immature niche industry, right? When it's still a small industry. But as it gets bigger, we start to see these technical failures break down, right? Like, Bitcoin has, its backlogs that happens from time to time. Not so bad anymore. And Ethereum, I mean, is usually like once a month whenever there's a large amount of influx. So the technology is basically unusable. So I feel like the promise of blockchain, right, has been put out there by Ethereum and Bitcoin and all of that, but nobody's really delivered on it. So it's this kind of cognitive dissonance. It's also another difficulty of like finding this middle ground with people, because there's this maximalism mindset where Bitcoin is the only one, right? But then when you start questioning them and say, well, I don't pay for stuff with Bitcoin. Nobody accepts Bitcoin. I have to use Litecoin because Bitcoin's just, unusable. They're like, oh, that's a, crap coin and yada, yada, yada. And they attack it and they attack it. Bitcoin's not meant to be cash. It's meant to be gold. And, then there's all these people saying it. So like that type of cognitive dissonance and the cultural issues are something that we've found to be pretty difficult, which is something that we kind of just decided, well, we need to, how should I say it? We need to start from the ground up with some of these things, just like our infrastructure. I had to build all of our block explorers and mining pools and everything like that from the ground up. Right? And the same thing with the I guess cultural issues is we a lot of crypto conferences are just like, how much money do you have to put yourself on stage? And, I'm going to do this retarded large ICO and raise trillions of dollars or millions of dollars. And then, I'm going to give people this promise and then, think that I can deliver on it. But like, one thing I learned, another really unique challenge is just to learn to think in the way that would create architecture that would make it work. Because a lot of people have the tendency to just want to go centralized because it's easier, right? It's faster, it's easier, and then they use the excuse to say, the blockchain trilemma. There's only two of the three can be possibly ever known. Scalability, security, and decentralization. You can only have two of the three. And so there's a lot of narratives that have come out just because of other people's technical limitations and maybe even cognitive limitations in their ability to see it and the overselling and under delivering. Right. So because of that, like, we're a project that's actually doing these things. And there's so many scams out there that have, claimed to do things like, we're going to be the, new, scaling coin or, quantum resistor, or, and they haven't actually done it. So there's so many people that have gotten burned from that. They come to us and they give us a hard time at first, but ultimately, like, it ends up working in our favor because people realize, oh, wow, Nexus is actually doing these things. We're not overselling ourselves and under delivering. We're actually, trying to undersell ourselves and over deliver, right? And that's kind of one of our mottos that we take really seriously. So it's kind of like a mix of all those, the infrastructural issues, and then also just the simple issues of, like I was saying, we have cultural issues, and there's so many scams that when you're actually doing what other people have been pretending to do through scams, you have a harder time. You kind of going against the grain, right? Because people are just naturally going to assume that you're a scam because you're saying something that someone else says that they're going to do. Like Filecoin's a great example. They raised 200, 300 million and they're claiming to do this file system stuff. But like when I look at their architecture, it shows a misunderstanding of the core fundamentals, which, I can't say you're not born with it. When I started coding, I started with the Bitcoin code base because I wanted to learn from Satoshi. And so I started with a really old Bitcoin code base so that I could learn and read Satoshi's comments itself. And so like, adding to the difficult challenges, like learning to think like Satoshi was another really, really difficult thing to do. Because there's a certain way of thinking that conventional programming is just totally different. When you program a conventional client server, even when I found out about crypto, I was like, yeah, get out of here. That sounds like a scam. Like, where's the money coming from, right? Until I found out about the whole decentralization aspect of it and creating new economic systems, I was like, okay, this will work, right? So learning to think that way is also another really, really important thing. That's where a lot of the architecture comes from. But I've, noticed a lot of the industry hasn't really adjusted that, or they're doing CEOs of their corporate coin. And it's just there's a lot of saying while they're doing the other thing, right? So naturally, when we approach people or whatever, they're going to have, I guess, more of a guard because they've been burned so many times by so many people that have just been, for lack of better words, bullshitting.
So you said you looked at an old code base by Satoshi so you could read his comments. I'm curious, what did you learn through that process about this technology?
I learned to think like him, like, is the best way. Like you see little comments like, "Hey, when NTP is activated, then remove this timestamp." Right? NTP stands for Network Time Protocol. So I was like, that's one of the places I started. I was like, oh, Network Time Protocol. Look at that. I'm like, okay, this is a clock synchronization protocol. Well, it relies on a central server to synchronize the clocks. I was like, that's not going to work. Let's make it decentralized, right? And then also just looking at all of the consensus rules, right? Like checking for unique transactions and duplicates and yada 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 yada. All the list goes on. It trained me to start to think in that adversarial mindset in a way, and that decentralized mindset, right? Where you have consensus critical code, and then you have non-consensus critical code, and then in order to modify this specific consensus, you have to modify the consensus rules and a time lock activation and so on and so forth. So the ultimate thing that I really learned from Satoshi in that is just to think in that adversarial decentralized way, because when you're a coder, right, before blockchain anyway, you think in client server. You think, hey, I'm making a connection to this person. They're servicing it. They have a database. I'm talking to their database, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But with Bitcoin, it's just a totally different animal, right? And all of these inefficiencies are magnified, right? When you multiply this thing out, when it geometrically expands to different people, right? Tons, thousands of nodes running around, right? Like, you have this whole different animal, right, of debugging and thinking in that way too. So yeah, a lot of it was just reading simple comments and seeing, oh, well, Satoshi was wanting to do this, so I might as well finish it, right? Because Bitcoin was a prototype. It's actually still technically in beta based on their versions. They haven't updated it to a production release. That's why it starts with a zero. Zero designates that it's still a beta. So I mean, they've never updated that, right? So it's it's still, I mean, I consider a prototype. Especially how script works and stuff like that. Like the concepts are there, it works, it does the job, but it doesn't do the job well, right? And so I kind of took that, like, what is the job, and saw where Satoshi was really kind of going with it, and then I kind of put myself in those shoes of saying, well, if I were Satoshi, what else would I work on? So I noticed a lot of things, like him working on the database. And I realized how slow the database was too. Berkeley database is, what was used back then. And so I created my own database, because it's just, well, we need a blockchain specific database design. And a lot of people are just makeshifting this, like Ethereum, Bitcoin, they all use Google's LevelDB, which works. It's one of the better databases out there, like, for production, but it's just not built for blockchains. And blockchains are an ever growing data set, right? So, you know, that we've gone down to even those little details, right? The database storage engine, because that's a fundamental bottleneck for the entire system, right? So it's mostly just learning how we thought, just by reading code. It's kind of like a psychological map. I mean, that's how I learned to code anyway. When I was 11, I read other people's code, and I started tinkering and building stuff and making games and stuff. So it was kind of pretty natural for me when I got into blockchain. It was like, hey, go read the code, and start to understand it, and pull it apart and break it, and learn from all of the things that it does, and so yeah, yeah.
Would you consider yourself a Bitcoiner? Why or why not?
I mean, I respect Bitcoin's roots. Like, I mean, if I own any Bitcoin, no, I don't. I mean, I I personally, like, I respect Satoshi. Right? I respect Satoshi's work. I respect the Bitcoin developers up to 2014. I mean, Jeff Garzik, one of the original Bitcoin developers, is actually one of our advisors, and he's a good friend of mine. So I respect a lot of the work that was done on that, but since I wouldn't say Bitcoin is consistent with its founding principles, especially it the cognitive dissonance is just something that makes it difficult, or more and more difficult, to have any reasonable conversations with people, because there is a lot of beliefs, and how should I say it? There's a lot of misinformation going around, such as the block size debate, which they said, one of the biggest reasons for Blockstream's narrative about having small blocks was that mom and pop can't run a node if the blocks get too big, right? So they limited the block size, or kept it limited at 1 megabyte. But then at the end of 2017, it was $200 to send a Bitcoin. I mean, sometimes I see it costs $30, $40 these days, right? Just to send it over the chain. And the thing is, like, a 1 terabyte hard drive is $100, right? $200. So if we're talking about this, like, mom and pop can't use it because it's going to take too much storage space, but yet it costs $200 to send a transaction, that narrative doesn't really make sense now, does it? Right? And so I consider myself like a crypto purist, right? And the pure aspect of Bitcoin, which doesn't mean Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV. I think those were very poorly implemented. Okay, so I'm not into any of those. I mean, but the pure roots of Bitcoin. Right? If you look on our repository for Nexusoft, you'll see Bitcoin version 1.0, like the very first Bitcoin code base. And I have that there to say, we have this here so that we better know where we're going by knowing where we've been, right? So in the purest sense, yes, I'm a Bitcoiner, but Bitcoin is not that anymore. So that's why I do Nexus, right? And I wouldn't be involved in the industry if it wasn't for Nexus, because I think a lot of it's a joke, to be honest. A lot of projects, a lot of BS, a lot of like false narratives. It's just turned into the same venture capitalist stuff that we built this to protect ourselves from, right? So in the crypto purism, Bitcoin, yes, I'm a Bitcoiner in the original sense of it, but what it is now, I couldn't say that, because I think it's become something so far from Bitcoin. Yeah, it's $50,000-$60,000 a coin. Yeah, sure, great, money, but it's lost those founding principles. It's lost that intention to actually make the world a better place. And that's something that I'm just really pretty diehard on. I I believe this technology is here to make the world a better place, and it can liberate people. And so, I believe so strongly in that yes, I keep true to the original founding principles of Bitcoin, but very few projects I see these days actually retain those.
Bitcoin has become what it hated.
Yeah, I mean, it's become what it set out to defeat. And part of that is because of this invasion, right? I mean, if you look at it, what's the central point of failure in Bitcoin? GitHub. Right? So that's what was targeted. And in 2016, if you look, I mean, especially like Reddit or RBTC or whatever, before Thamos and all of them started censoring stuff, right? Like the narrative used to be from the mainstream media, Bitcoin is like the tulip bubble and it's going to collapse and it's full of hot air and it's BS and blah, blah, blah. And, there's a covert Bitcoin wars and, FBI was trying to raid people and all that. And then all of a sudden, after 2013, after Ross Ulbricht gets taken out, all of a sudden this company pops up, Blockstream. And that's when they start the narrative. 2014 is the year that Bitcoin really grew up and became, a mature industry and blah, 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 blah. And that's when they started the block size debate, right? And they created a civil war that successfully split the Bitcoin community into multiple communities. And then even the split of the community split again, and it's just like, so yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin, to me, it means, bringing people together, making the world a better place. And so, yeah, it really has lost touch with that. But that doesn't mean that it can't still find that again, right? And that's one thing that we do with Nexus, right? Is, the lower level database, for instance, it can be used on Bitcoin, right? And that will make a massive difference. It's a constant time database, which means it doesn't slow down as you add more data to it. With Bitcoin or Ethereum, the more transactions you have on the network, the slower everything else is going to process, right? Because you just have more data to search through when you're trying to find a transaction on the disk. I made a database that's constant time. So one thing that I'm going to do, is, instead of pointing a finger and saying, oh yeah, Bitcoin's bad, we're going to set a new example, right? We're setting new cultural examples through creating events. And then I'm going to be, building a Bitcoin node, let's call it. I'm going to be taking some of the Bitcoin code and I'm going to release a Nexus Bitcoin node that includes the Nexus lower level database, lower level protocol, all these things. Like, for instance, like Bitcoin, using the old Bitcoin legacy code, at 100 connections on my node, I was running at 90% CPU usage and it was shitting all over itself, right? Now with Nexus, with the lower level protocol, I'm running 400 connections and it's 5% CPU usage, right? So there's so many inefficiencies in Bitcoin that like haven't been addressed. That's why the whole like Bitcoin can't scale narrative is just malarkey to me. Because I've seen it scale. I've taken that actually legacy technology and scaled it even so. So I'm going to do that for Bitcoin as well, to hope that maybe Bitcoin can find its roots again. But I kind of consider Bitcoin the tube. It's always going to probably be around in some way, shape, or form, just like tube amplifiers, right? They're an important aspect of music, right? You want a tube amplifier. It sounds really nice and warm, but tubes are incredibly impractical for computation because they're big. They're very big and their architecture is archaic, right? So, Nexus is the transistor and Bitcoin is the tube. And I think Bitcoin will probably always have some niche area. It's probably going to end up becoming some store of value. And, the central banks and, like JP Morgan Chase and all, they've been pushing Bitcoin, as a part, of their new narrative, right? So, I don't necessarily think it's going to go away anywhere, right? Even though it's technically not capable of doing more than a transaction or two per second. And I think the Lightning Network stuff is going to fall apart because people, for one, they don't want to use that. It's risky and it just feels exactly like a bank. So I think that's one reason why there's this Bitcoin maximalism agenda, is that's a way to try to curb competition from Bitcoin, right? Well, it's become limited. I mean, you can't even use script on Bitcoin anymore because they've completely eliminated all of these opcodes. So you only have a few basic opcodes that you can use anymore. And then they want you to do everything on, the liquid side chain, which is Blockstream's for-profit side chain that, has, confidential transactions and all this other stuff. So I'm cautious. I'm cautious and I'm cautiously optimistic about it. And I still see a lot of true Bitcoiners. So when it comes to it, our philosophy with Nexus has always been, okay, we're not here to shit on Bitcoin to say we're better. We're here to actually build stuff that will help make Bitcoin better too, right? Respect your roots. If it wasn't for Bitcoin, we wouldn't be here, right? And that's why I say, like, in the true purest sense of Bitcoin, I'm absolutely like, I respect Satoshi. I respect the code. I appreciate what he did. I appreciate being able to read that. And now, our way of giving back is by creating this node, this Bitcoin wallet that you can use. It allows you to run a full node. It saves you about 30% disk space too, right? Through keychain compression that I created. So you can, let's say the Bitcoin blockchain is like, I think 200 gigabytes right now. So you'd save 60 gigabytes off of it. So now you've got 140 gigabyte blockchain, and it'll sync way faster because the database engine's faster, and it won't slow down as you get more data on it, right? So even something that simple, I think, will set that example. So that's kind of our philosophical way of doing things. Instead of pointing the finger, we just say, hey, we built this. If you enjoy it, if you want to use it, so be it. And eventually that Bitcoin, LOD, node could become, a pull request on the main Bitcoin core. I mean, I'm not really planning on that because, like, my personal perspective is the Bitcoin developers have an agenda that maybe not necessarily reflected by the people that use it. So I just don't see any point in trying to get our code merged into Bitcoin Core. But we'll definitely release our own nodes, and that will be kind of a cross promotional thing. And that's our way of giving back to Bitcoin. Okay, well, you got this block size issue. You've got you saying the blocks are too big so people can't download them, and it gets slow and whatever. Well, hey, guess what? We built a database that fixes all of that, and now you save 30% off your disks, and now you 140 gigabyte blockchain, not 200 gigabyte blockchain. Simple things like that, I think, will be really valuable in helping maybe change that narrative slightly to say, well, we can do this. Here, we're showing you it being done. Not talking about, that's pointing fingers. That's talking. We do. We show, and we do it in an action-oriented way.
We tell ourselves stories in the crypto industry that everything we are doing is towards a better world. But in many ways, some of the technology that's being discussed in crypto, in my opinion, is more dystopic even than that which came before it. Do you
Oh, yeah.
agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I say there's this infiltration aspect of it, right? What Mahatma Gandhi said. First they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they join you, then you win, right? So they joined, they first tried to laugh at Bitcoin. It's a tulip, but it's never going to go anywhere. Oh, it's illegal. It's used for illegal drugs. Scary Bitcoin, right? And then they fought, they did the covert Bitcoin wars. Like, I had a lot of friends out here that got wrapped into that. And then they joined, right? They took it over. So, we look at this vaccine stuff, right? Gates now is saying, hey, we're going to do, a blockchain vaccine card that's going to require blockchain authentication, right? And that's why it's so important for us to be on this front because, whatever, if you believe, that there's, the world's perfect and whatever, what I've observed is that there is definitely a group of international bankers that do not have people's best interests at heart, right? And they tend to compromise things and try to redirect things in their favor, right? And so Bitcoin, with the Lightning Network and block size debate, they have successfully did that, and now they're redirecting it further with, some of the patents Microsoft has had too, such as like mining from your biometrics, and all this other really dystopian stuff. So, I agree absolutely. There's there's this cognitive dissonance where people think like, oh yeah, we're gonna save people by having blockchain vaccine cards, but it's like, when you realize, people are dying from taking this vaccine. You may think you're doing right, but that's why it's so important for projects like us to exist, because you can't tell somebody with cognitive dissonance that they have cognitive dissonance, because the reaction when you challenge cognitive dissonance is anger, right? They get mad at you, they yell at you, they attack you, right? Anytime you challenge it. So what we do is we're showing a more practical application. We're showing a way that actually helps people, so that when somebody goes out and says, oh, hey, we're helping people by making these mandatory Ethereum vaccine cards, people are going to be like, well, why wouldn't you just be like tracking supply chains for organic certification, like Nexus is doing? Or why wouldn't you be helping with alternative energy? Or why wouldn't you be helping with carbon credits like Nexus is doing? It sets this new example that gives other people the ability to kind of discern better, because it's just, I think a lot of it is just, there's a limited availability of information, and there's a lot of misinformation about it. And people are really excited about it, that they jump in and then they think that it is this new thing, and there's not enough counter perspectives to that. So that's something that we hope to achieve as we continue to grow, is to kind of help heal that narrative and keep those founding principles of Satoshi alive, right? In Nexus, finishing what Satoshi never finished, because he left in December 2010. He left completely. He left it with Gavin Andresen, but I mean, it was just left to go, and that's one way to do it, which I think Satoshi did the right thing by the way he did it, right? But in my opinion, in order to see full global world adoption, like there's so much more than you're gonna know the day you launch it, or even a year after you launch it. I mean, Nexus was called CoinShield originally, right? And we were working on stopping the scams, and some of the original technology formed from that, and then Nexus kind of was born out of that. I mean, multiple years later, right? So, I mean, we even after my studying of the code, I didn't know. I didn't know everything that it would be useful for, or every all these different features. Like I didn't have a 7-layer software stack that came in 2017, right? It takes time for these things to be developed and designed, right? And I'm thinking 100 years, 1,000 years down the line, of developing a system that can last and allow people, this example of like, well, hey, we don't need governments anymore. We can watch our titles and deeds. We can engage in contracts, and we can still engage in law with one another, but it's kind of a temporal geospatial binding law, right? Like, hey, you and me, let's say, decide to do a contract with one another where you're going to do this and I'm going to do that, and then we engage in that contract, and it's legally binding for the duration of that contract, right? So we gotta, how should I say it? We got to render a lot of these things obsolete by creating these new models, right? And so, yeah, I definitely agree. It is somewhat disturbing that's happening, but like I said, I wouldn't be involved in the industry if it wasn't for Nexus, because Nexus is our way of doing something about it, right? And doing it in a non-confronting way, right? Doing it in as peaceful way as possible. Like Buckminster Fuller said, you don't change things by fighting the existing reality. You change things by creating a new model that renders the existing model obsolete. And that's where Roger went wrong, is he was trying to fight. He was fighting the existing reality, and he may have had some good intentions, but he really ultimately he created 2 Bitcoins. Then he labels it as Bitcoin Cash, and then like old ladies go and they try to buy. They're like, what do I buy? Bitcoin Cash, or do I buy Bitcoin Cash with cash, and then I buy Bitcoin with my debit card? It just created all of this massive confusion, and that's part of the reason that like that has become a stink, right? It was just it was not the proper way to do it. The Bitcoin maximalists are right. I agree that like you shouldn't call it Bitcoin, even though he does have a legitimate point that it is closer to Satoshi's original vision of Bitcoin, peer-to-peer electronic cash. It still like was implemented incorrectly, right? Like I like as Eric Voorhees said, no, Roger, the Bitcoin blockchain is the chain from the Genesis block with the most proof of work. And that is true. That is the consensus of Bitcoin. That is the most proof of work from the Genesis block. So Bitcoin Cash isn't. If it had more proof of work, then it would be the legitimate chain, but it didn't, right? So it only mattered, quote unquote, when it was between Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV. So, yeah, a lot of those things, like, yeah, they're somewhat concerning, but not so much to us, because like I think the truth ultimately prevails, and all of this malarkey that's going around in the world is just temporary. It's temporary victories, right? These people think that they're victorious, right, temporarily, but ultimately in the long run, I don't think they're going to be the ones that actually see the future, right? The ones that see the future are the ones that overcome all of these obstacles, right? And that's something that we're working towards, and getting closer to that every day.
What's the intersection between blockchain and rockets?
Not necessarily the rockets, is I guess an indirect relationship from the rockets through the satellites. This was something that my dad, I'd always grown up, right, like with rockets, SpaceX, like, oh, here's Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Bill Nye, science guy, whatever. It was just like growing up to me, right? I was just like, okay, yeah, whatever, cool. So I kind of took it for granted, and then my dad and I started talking when I think this was 2016 when he started Vector. And it actually originally started with Jeff Garzik, right? If you're familiar with Jeff Garzik, he done Vegan Space Systems and Block, the company BLOQ. He's still around. He's still, I got a lot of respect for the guy too, because he handled the Blockstream fiasco very well. I'm really impressed by the way he handled it. He was smart in the way he handled it. He didn't create conflict. He just, created new models. But he started with this original blockchain in space idea, where he wanted to take these satellites and run a blockchain node on it, right? Now he has since created Space Chain, where they're doing this blockchain OS and stuff. But it kind of, that started the original idea, right? And then I was talking to my father about it. I was like, hey, we got to get you connected with Jeff. And then me and him started talking, and they were working on this thing called Galactic Sky, which is supposed to be software-defined satellites, right? Which is something that hasn't been done before. Most of them are hardware defined, which means you can't just go run any arbitrary software on the satellites. You have to upload it and everything like that. So their galactic sky model was looking for use cases, and that's kind of where we came in 2016. My father, made a tweet, on BBC, I think is, keyword is Bitcoin in space, and it was part of them building use cases for galactic sky. And so, then that kind of that started our pursuit, right? We're like, okay, that's where Nexus got the satellite name, right, in 2016. But then I started thinking, I was just like, okay, well, we're trying to build this decentralized system. If we're relying on this centralized galactic sky, like they can just shut us out anytime we want, right? So, okay, that's not good. We need to think of how to make it decentralized. So we hired a guy from Iridium, through 2017 to help kind of design that. He ended up being a fluke. He didn't really make much progress, but I thought about this stuff over the years, right, for many, many years. And then 2020 came around, and this satellite stuff had kind of, Vector kind of went bankrupt. And, we kind of put this satellite stuff on the back burner because we wanted to just finish Tritium, which was the first update of the Tau framework. And so we kind of put that on the side. And then, my friend Nathan came into town and he was like, dude, we got to get this satellite stuff going again. I was like, well, dude, we always run into this centralized issue, frequency licensing, right? You have to deal with this organization called the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union. And they allocate frequencies for you, right? Because they have the justification to control these frequencies because interference patterns, right? So I was always kind of at that standstill. Is like, okay, we're planning on launching one with UHF VHF, which stands for ultra high frequency, very high frequency. Another word for it is ham radio. And you can use that, with an amateur radio license. So, but it's really like nine bits per second or 9 kilobits per second. Like, it is nothing. Kilobits, right? So that's like a kilobyte a second. Downlink is nothing, right? So that was just going to be like our test run, right? But then, Nathan came in and he started talking about phased array antennas. And he just has always been talking about it. And I was just kind of like, yeah, whatever, until he was like, finally, he's like, dude, you need to look into this stuff. So I started looking into phased array antennas, and then it clicked. I was like, oh my gosh, right? This makes sense. Because a phased array antenna, if you have a dish, right? If you ever had satellite dish or whatever, you have to point that dish to the satellite, right? Because it's a geosynchronous satellite. So if you have, it works if it's geosynchronous, which means it's orbiting as fast as the Earth rotates. So it's always going to be the same point in the sky. But once you start getting in a LEO, low Earth orbit, that dish would be constantly having to move to track that satellite, right? Dishes give you extremely high gain, right? Really high gain, like 33 dBi or more. So phased array antennas give you that high of gain, but allows you to electronically point it. Okay, so you're actually using wave interference. If you've ever like dropped a bunch of rocks or pebbles in a pond and you see how the ripples interfere with one another, right? And then you'll see like one strong ripple will push another ripple to the left, right? If it's coming at it. That's a good example of like how a phased array works, right? Is you're creating these interferences from these outer antenna elements that force the inner RF basically into a fine-tuned beam, right? So that you can get these really high directional gains, but it can shift it immediately. It can move, a fraction of a second because it's all electronic. It's all solid state. There's no moving parts. You're just using fields. You're modulating fields. So that started and I was like, okay, man, like this looks like I think this is step. So I started doing some research and then I found 5.8 gigahertz and ISM frequencies, which stands for Industrial Scientific Medical. And it's what your Wi-Fi uses, right? It uses two ISM frequencies, 2.4 gigahertz and 5875 or 5725 to 5875. It's 150 megahertz bandwidth, but that it's an unlicensed frequency that basically you have to accept harmful interference from other people, but you can run as long as you only broadcast at 1 watt. Right? You have a 1 watt broadcasting limit. So I started diving into all these path loss equations and everything. I finally derived the answer. I was like, okay, we need 33 dBi to make a connection with a 500 kilometer inclination in an orbit, right? At 1 watt transmitting power. And I looked around and I found phased array antennas could do 30, 40 dBi very easily. And that started this whole, oh my gosh, this is actually within reach now, right? Because before it was this whole massive headache of a multi-million-dollar licensing to get an ITU, but then you have to have that license under a company. So there's always going to be some company that owns that frequency licensing. So you can't have it be this open internet protocol like we wanted. And so over time, I basically, I put together these ISM frequencies, these phased array antennas, And then I started thinking about routing, right? A lot of people, if you've seen some people in Bitcoin have tried to do mesh networks and stuff, it doesn't work because it's using IP addresses. An IP address is designed for static meshes and nodes, right? It's a static system. And it essentially is kind of like a machine readable mapping to a physical geolocation. And that's how the routing system works for the internet. But if you have these moving nodes and these moving satellites, IP addresses just aren't going to work for addressing on the network layer, right? So, kind of combining, I guess, some of my experience. I've hung out with a lot of guys in the IETF Internet Engineering Task Force for a number of years too, since like 2017, and like learned all of their old network tricks and stuff like that. I mean, some of the original founders of the internet. Dino Farinacci was the first fellow for Cisco, among others. And so that kind of laid the foundation to where we'd always joked about, Dino would be like, oh, when you invent IP version 12 someday, Colin, and be like, oh, I was like, no, but I think we really need IP version 12 because we need to address, 256 bits and blah, blah, blah. And then we joke and laugh about it. And then finally, one day I just popped. I was just like, oh my gosh, we can build a stateless routing system, right? That doesn't require all this state. And that's where the Nexus protocol kind of was born. I passed it by my friend Victor, who's a distinguished engineer at Cisco again. It was just like, Victor, like, tell me if I'm missing something here, man. But like, I think routing is really, really, really simple. Like, we should be able to route with GPS coordinates. We shouldn't need all these IP addresses and all these static meshes and nodes and all this infrastructure or all this state. You shouldn't have to upload all these IP addresses. We should be able to just point and shoot, and then follow a pathfinding routine where you point, to your nearest node, and then that node uplinks to a satellite, and then it links along those satellites till it gets over a geolocation where it needs to downlink to the wide radius locator, and then it goes down and so on and so forth. So, I spent quite a bit of time chatting with him to get that routing system, I guess, designed, and then that all kind of culminated in a white paper that I released on December 21st of 2020. It's the full blown architecture for the whole thing. So it started out as a really simple, novel concept, right? Kind of based off of Jeff Garza to just increase the redundancy for nodes running in space. And, part of the justification was that, we're building this disruptive technology that has the potential to, challenge countries and telecommunication systems. So we need to have our own telecommunication system, especially net neutrality is being repealed and all that stuff at the time. And then it grew into a full-blown new protocol and actually a new stack now for the internet, which it currently runs on the OSI, and so we have now the one stack instead of the OSI stack, which OSI stands for Open Systems Interconnection. The one stack stands for the Open Nexus Execution Stack. So one more point too, through kind of running by the IETF and doing working groups at the IETF, which that's kind of like the doghouse. I mean, it's full of the world's best developers that have all been doing network stuff for 40, 50 years, right? So, they're all very set in their ways. They're very confident in themselves, and there's no young people at the IETF, no young people, right? I'm 30. So I go there. Back at the time I was like 27, 26. So I go to the IETF and I would test it out. I would test out some of these architectures, like, adding the consensus layer for doing root of trust and all of these different things. And I walked away unscathed, right? So the internet protocol kind of like I said, I'd be lying if I said I had everything figured out. And when I started this project, it kind of all this incrementally came in pieces. And that 2020 really was a huge leap in architectural development to actually make this satellite system go from this woo-woo, like, oh yeah, what's the point? What's the value proposition? Why would we want it up there? Why are you going to do that? Yeah, cool. Like, it's a good idea, but like, why, right? To answering all those questions and also answering the hows of all of the technical specifications of it, right? And, that's what that white paper was. And so it's kind of interesting how it all kind of formed together, right? And then Nexus ends up being a great name for a new internet protocol too, right? You got Nexus and you got the internet, you got IP and you got NP, right? And so, it's been a really, really beautiful journey kind of learning about all of these different things. And I've been very fortunate to learn from so many really, advanced people, in like internet and telecommunication and satellites and space and everything. And, a lot of those disciplines kind of have been combined together into this. But, even more recently, especially 2020, considering, all of these incredible issues with the internet have started to splinter through, right? The internet is like being censored. There's net neutrality. I mean, I mean, I can't even sync my nodes sometimes because my ISP is limiting Nexus traffic, right? So it's just the problems are becoming more and more and more and more apparent, which just kind of further to improves the value proposition. And so the ultimate, I guess, how should I say it? The best way to describe this new internet protocol is, the Bitcoin blockchain builds itself, right? Because there's a monetary incentive to mine Bitcoins because you earn Bitcoins for processing transactions, right? Now take that concept and apply that to your router, to your computer, right? Instead of buying a router and then paying a yearly or a monthly subscription fee to an ISP, now you're going to just buy a router that's going to then turn into profit rather than the other way around. So it's going to create this new gamified economic model where the network itself will pretty much build itself, right? And that's part of the design of it, and that's where I see it as extremely practical now, is because the game theory is really solid, and the architecture is very solid. The routing system is very well formed, and all of these hopes and dreams now have become practical architectures that are in implementation phases right now.
What does all this look like in the year 2100?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I guess I could say what I'd hope to see, is probably the most honestly way I can answer that. Is I would hope to see kind of a world more connected, but in the sense of, I think one of the biggest follies of the world is that people with conflicting value systems are forced under the same blanket of laws. I think, these large institutions and states kind of need to be replaced more with people systems. They need to be more decentralized and localized, right? So, I mean, I imagine kind of a world where you have fundamental common laws, right? Do no harm. You don't harm one another. But ultimately, like, each city can somewhat self-regulate and choose, their quote unquote theme, right? Hey, this is a city that's, for cannabis smokers, and this is a city for people who like to have orgies. I mean, there's a place for everybody, and you can't say that, like, somebody liking to do an orgy or somebody who likes to smoke cannabis, that those are wrong, right? They may be right for that person, right? They may resonate with that person, but maybe not for you. And so, you know, I think that's really like how the future needs to be, because I think everybody has the fundamental God-given right to practice what they value, right? But we're in this system that's trying to capture all of these people under a single economic system, right? And putting these blanket laws across all of them. Let's say the United States, for an example, right? Which it works, it's great, but when you don't need how should I say it, when you don't need these blanket laws across all of these 50 states for economic abundance, then the way that we see law and institutions and states is going to change. We're going to start seeing, well, we don't need a governor to tell us in this whole state, like, the city functions perfectly fine by itself. Well, why do we need this government? Well, because they're managing budgets. Oh, they're getting money from this central reserve and stuff. So with this embassy model that we've developed with Nexus, it takes off more and proliferates. And I imagine there being more sovereign, localized places where people can practice what they believe, what they value. And Nexus is kind of here to be kind of that neurotransmitter, I guess, or the neural circuitry between all of these places and people, right? To help enforce natural laws, right? And circumstantial contracts, right? I kind of call them or even geospatial contracts, right? Like, I enter into a city, since it's a GPS or a geolocated routing system, then you can actually, through the routing system, engage in these geospatial contracts, right? So, hey, you enter the city, you get a list. Hey, hey, make sure you wear a shirt here, or this is a mass city, or whatever. Like, it gives people that freedom, and I think if people have that freedom to really express what they value, I think the world is just going to be abundant in so many ways. I mean, right now, people just have a hard time coping with the reality of things, how messed up everything is. And it's a full-time job just to cope with that. When we take that away, and then you give people the ability to really thrive and build, and having an economy that accurately reflects their value they put into it, that's not constantly losing value, and doesn't require all of these institutional states to create something that's abundant for them. If they can just have this globally abundant, economic system, then I think people will be able to start to have that, and then even just in a really out there perspective too. Let's say murderers, people that like to murder, right? From what I've observed of serial killers, is it's a game, right? They want the police to chase them. It's this big hunt, right? If you've ever read like the Hunt, or there's this short story like The Best Hunt, or it's about this like guy that like hunts another guy because he became such a good hunter that he just was bored with animals and he wants to hunt humans, right? So even murderers, right? There's a place where they can go practice murdering each other on their own island where they murder each other. And you go to that island, it's, hey, king murders the king, and that's how you become a part. And if you want to go hunt and you want to go kill people, that's your place to go do it, right? And then other people don't get to be innocent bystanders in that, right? So like even something as radical as that, as long as it's not doing any lack of consensual harm, right? Like as long as people aren't violated, I don't see anything wrong with it. As long as if that's the sport that somebody wants, that's their sport, right? As long as people know that's what they're getting into when they end up in those places. And that's where the geospatial contracts are important, because, hey, I could be, cruising around and then I get within a radius of an island and it says, yo, hey, Murder Island, you might want to turn back if you don't want to go hunt, And so you create, this type of alert system. So that's kind of how I see. I would hope the future would unfold, because I think everybody does have their God-given right to practice what they value, as long as it's not in violation of somebody else, right? And Nexus is here to kind of help nurture that and give them those opportunities where they weren't there before, and a universal basic opportunity rather than a universal basic income. The basic income just creates lethargy, but the opportunity gives people chances where they didn't have it before, and then they can create their own abundance. And it's teaching them to fish rather than giving them the fish, right? So yeah, that's my vision. I think of the future, and I think the world would be a much better place if that was possible.
We've spoken today with Colin Cantrell, the chief architect of Nexus, which you can learn more about at nexus.io. You can also follow Colin on Twitter at Colin J. Cantrell. Thank you so much, Colin, for speaking with us today, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.